Well, it is now with great pleasure I introduce our guest speaker, Teneesa Islam. I think I had the honor of being the worship service coordinator the first time she was here, and oh my goodness, life has taken off, huh, Teneesa?
Yeah.
So she'll do a much better job of a little better introduction than I'm doing here. So now, would you like to hold it or?
Yeah. Is it okay if I stand over here? I'm not a huge fan of
Absolutely.
podiums because they cover like a course of me usually. Thank you for inviting me back and having me. My colleague Jen Dreisky was here a couple of times as well. She is the deputy director at the organization I founded in 2017, South Dakota Voices for Peace. So my name is Teneesa Islam. I am a mom. I am an immigration attorney. I'm an executive director. And I moved here in 2012 with my husband and then oldest son. And in 2013, I started my private immigration law practice in conjunction with a Bush Foundation Leadership Fellowship, where I was looking at access to legal services to low and moderate income community members. Then fast forward to the election cycle of 2016, where we know that Muslims, immigrants, and refugees were key targets of the vitriolic rhetoric that we started to kind of hear again. And that is my faith. I'm a Muslim by faith. My parents are immigrants from Bangladesh. I was born and raised in Michigan. And my clients were immigrants and refugees. So all of those things became very real in terms of what I was fearing was going to happen. And sure enough, in 2017, I received a phone call from a friend who is a lobbyist in Pierre, South Dakota, our state capital. And she said, Teneesa, I'm really worried about all of the negative things and vitriolic things that I'm seeing against refugees and Muslims in particular. So I did what I know to do, which is to organize community. I went to law school in St. Paul and did that work in the Twin Cities for about 7 years before moving here. And I organized our communities, and we went to Pierre to be our own voice, right? To show up and say, we are here, we are part of the fabric of South Dakota, and you can't legislate us out. So the good news is, from 2017 to 2019, our coalition was able to defeat 12 out of 14 of those bills and resolutions. But it's sad that we had so many, and that we needed to do that work. But from that work, we understood that we needed to do a lot more. We needed to educate communities, we needed to advocate for communities, we needed to lift communities. And so that's how South Dakota Voices for Peace started in 2017. And our sister organization is South Dakota Voices for Justice, which is our lobbying 501c4 arm. So we have both. I was asked today to talk about immigration, and it's such a large topic. I'm excited to stay and be a part of the round table discussion where you can ask more specific questions. But I will just give you some snippets of different things I think may interest you, and then we can deepen that conversation afterwards, if that's okay. So at South Dakota Voices for Peace, we provide free immigration legal services to two groups of really vulnerable people in our community. The first is unaccompanied minors from Central America. If you don't know about this issue, since about 2012, I would say 2013 is when we first saw children coming to our southern border and being put into detention centers, if you remember that. Well, it's been happening way before that, and it continues to happen, but that's when we really started to see the media images. Long story short, these children are coming on their own, and that's why they're classified as unaccompanied minors by law, which triggers some special protections for them under the law as well. But they were traveling by foot and by bus and whatever it takes to come to our southern border. 98% of them turn themselves in at a border checkpoint and ask for asylum. When that happens, they get put into detention centers and automatically get into what we call removal proceedings, otherwise known as deportation proceedings in immigration courts. Because there's such a severe backlog, a process that started in about 2013-14 is if the child was able to identify someone that they knew in the United States, that person is called a sponsor, would go through a background check. And if the background check's cleared, then they would, the child would be sent to that sponsor to live with them essentially through their immigration court proceedings, which can take 10 years. There's no timeline for that, and immigration is a very frustrating process for everyone involved. And so we know from the data that's been collected since 2014 specifically that we have over 600 unaccompanied minors who've been released to a sponsor living somewhere in South Dakota. We don't know where exactly, but we started our free immigration legal services because I convinced an amazing group of people that we needed to do this for our kids. Immigration court is regional. It's very separate and different from civil court or criminal court. Our court for North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota is located in Fort Snelling, Minnesota. So now imagine you're 12 years old, you don't know any English, you were held in a detention center for hopefully just 1 month. You get shipped to someone you probably have never met before but knew they existed. And now you have to get to immigration court in Minneapolis. There's just so many hurdles that it became a really profound issue in our state. And with the great generosity of people just like you, we raised $250,000 in a year and a half to launch that service. And we need to keep raising that much money to continue to provide that service for our kids. The other group of people that we serve at Voices for Peace are survivors of violence that take place here in the United States. And of that group, about 95% of our clients are actually undocumented women who are survivors of domestic abuse. And because they're a survivor of violence, they also have some special protections under immigration law that can set them onto a path of citizenship. Not everyone has this opportunity when they're here. Not all immigrants have that opportunity. So we really just felt that these two particular groups of people in our community had some real opportunity for hope and real opportunity to get to what we call oftentimes the American dream by gaining citizenship and being able to be lawfully present. So that's the work that we do at Voices for Peace. And oftentimes there's a lot of just such great misunderstanding about the immigration process in general. The way I describe it is that there's really 3 ways that if you weren't born here, that you can come here lawfully, okay? One is through a familial relationship, and it's not just anybody. It's a spouse, it's a mom or dad, it's a child, or perhaps a brother and sister. And just to give you a context for that, if I'm a U.S. citizen and I want to bring my married brother from Mexico, right now the wait time is over 20 years. And so for some people there's a lot of kind of myths out there that people can just come if you're related to someone, and that is not accurate. So one way is to come here through a family member. The second way would be to come through work. This is when an employer, oftentimes it's called, sponsors you. Again, this is a very difficult process. There's what we call very high-skilled jobs, like the scientists and the medical professionals. They are high-skill job categories, and then there's low-skill job categories, like agriculture, for example. So that is a visa process. Again, it costs a lot of money, and there's a lot of time involved in getting these visas. And interestingly enough, for our agricultural visas that a lot of people do receive, that means they can lawfully enter our country and lawfully work in that visa category. They have to then return after that season is done, and the employer has to apply again and pay the fees again for the person to come back. So it's a very convoluted process. The third way you can come here and hope for an opportunity to gain lawful status and citizenship is humanitarian. And that's really the work that we do at Voices for Peace, which is you apply for asylum, or if you're a survivor of violence, you can apply for what's called a U visa or a T visa. If you're a survivor of violence and the perpetrator of the violence is a U.S. citizen, or the step below being U.S. citizen is called a lawful permanent resident, oftentimes called a green card holder, then you would apply for something called VAWA. And then right now, you know, with the war and atrocities in Ukraine, we're seeing something called TPS. And TPS is temporary protected status, and the President of the United States has the power and authority to designate who can get TPS and for how long. So historically, we've had TPS for Haitians after the great natural disasters that were there, for example, or Nicaragua because of the wars that have been there. And there's a lot of controversy on how those categories are decided and who gets them. But right now, that's what it looks like many Ukrainians will be able to get. It's also really important to understand that because you get TPS status, it allows you to come here temporarily. You have lawful authority to work and to live here, but it can end when the president decides it's going to end. Now, all of these processes are very different from oftentimes what we know as the refugee resettlement process. So just very quickly, a refugee is someone who's in country A, let's say Ukraine, right, and is fleeing for some reason, whether it's a natural disaster or war, and they go to country B. If the United Nations has a presence there, you have to check in with them, which is oftentimes called a refugee camp, to be designated a refugee. And I didn't check up on the statistics before I came this morning, but we have the highest number of displaced persons in the world, and the majority of displaced people are because of climate change. And only about a third of those displaced people are actually categorized as refugees. I hope this is making sense. Again, we can ask questions during our circle talk that later today. But so once you get to country B, only 1% of those people who are designated a refugee get to come to country C, right, the United States. And the United States works with 10 different refugee resettlement agencies, and those agencies then decide where they will be placed. So Lutheran Immigration Relief Services is the big umbrella organization that works on refugee resettlement, and their office in South Dakota is Lutheran Social Services. So in our state of South Dakota, we only have one refugee resettlement organization in sight. And if someone is coming from country C, they would come directly to Sioux Falls. That would be someone who has been resettled in Sioux Falls. Now remember that if someone goes to Minneapolis, for example, that's their resettlement site. Once you enter the U.S., regardless of your immigration status, you are free to travel anywhere, right? So one of the bills in 2017 was actually to halt refugee resettlement in South Dakota. And what we gleaned from the reasons that the prime sponsors of that bill had was they actually didn't want refugees getting resettled in Minneapolis to come to South Dakota. And though it's very absurd because we all have the right to travel, when testifying, the senator asked me, "Are you saying we can't control our borders of South Dakota?" And I said, "Senator, respectfully, unless you build a wall around South Dakota and have border checkpoints, there really is no way you can determine who gets to come in and out." So luckily that bill failed, but then we saw that same kind of rhetoric develop in 2019 and wanting to end refugee resettlement as a whole, which the Trump administration did. The President of the United States every year gets to decide what the cap is on refugee resettlement. And so at the highest point in the Obama administration, the cap was 180,000. And that was the most our country has ever had historically. During the Trump administration, that dropped to about 10,000 total, which severely impacted refugee resettlement agencies because they were not getting people to come. So, I mean, I could spin off in a million different directions with all of these situations. Another really important thing to understand here in South Dakota specifically is we do have a very vibrant undocumented population. We have children in our community who were brought by their parents unlawfully, which means that they didn't have permission to come. As a human rights, civil rights activist, I do not call people illegal. Humans are not illegal. There's a big movement to make sure that we don't classify people as illegal. When you and I speed and we get a ticket and we break the law, we don't become illegal, we just broke the law. So these people similarly are breaking the law but not having permission to enter our country. And so when parents bring their children together, so this is separate from what I described before when children are coming by themselves to the border, we have over 10 million undocumented people in our country as a whole. Now, during the Obama administration, something was passed called DACA, or the Dreamers program. How many of you have heard about Dreamers before? So essentially, the administration allowed the children of those parents who came unlawfully, so they came unlawfully as well, to get a Social Security card so they could work lawfully. The big misconception with Dreamers is that it was some sort of lawful status, which in fact it was not. These kids now are in this like gray zone. They're not lawfully here, they're not unlawfully here, but they can work. They can work lawfully is what happened. And there's been a huge movement in the Dreamer community and immigration rights advocacy organizations to get Dreamers specifically a path to citizenship, which hasn't happened yet. One of the first things that happened during the Trump administration in 2017 that impacted me directly, but also in terms of the advocacy that I do around immigration issues, is we saw the Muslim travel ban, and then we also saw the announcement of ending the Dreamers program. And luckily, both of those things have been overturned since. So the state of immigration, I think a big myth also is that we are a nation that is open and welcoming to immigrants. But if you understand immigration history, immigration laws were first created to exclude people. There came a certain point, where we had ancestors coming on the ships, but there came a certain point in the mid-1800s with the first Chinese Exclusion Act. And that is really the bedrock and the foundation of the immigration system we have to deal with today. It's really a piecemeal system which decided who to exclude along the way and how that changed. And so it becomes a very complicated process and a very costly process. On average, for one of our kids, each case costs about $8,000 of our time. And that's because there's a lot of complications in each case that attorneys have to deal with and represent those clients in court. Similarly, the wait times for our kids right now, I had one client, set of twin girls actually, that were my clients in 2017, and we just were able to apply for their green cards. So again, life happens in 5 years, and life really did happen for these girls. They were 14 when I met them, and now they're 19, and they want to get married. They both have a child. And because of what they applied for, which is called special immigrant juvenile status, they can't get married until they get their green card. So luckily, we tell all our clients that in the beginning, imagine when you were 14 and your lawyer was telling you not to get married. But luckily, one of the twins called me. She's like, I'm getting married this summer. I said, no, you're not. You cannot. We have waited 5 years to apply for your green card. She was pregnant, so her pastor wanted her to get married. Her fiance's parents wanted her to get married. And she lives in Huron. I said, if I need to drive down there to talk to your pastor about what this means, right? This is your only chance to a path to citizenship. Otherwise, you'll be undocumented. You'll be living in the shadows. Once you have this child in the United States, your child will be a U.S. citizen. Right, and oftentimes what we see on the side of our domestic abuse clients is that is yielded as a tool of power over the abused spouse, right? I will take your kids, you can't do anything about that because they're U.S. citizens, and I'll make sure you get deported, right? And because of that fear, then the survivors of violence are scared to call the police, they're scared to go to, domestic abuse shelters and so on. So there's a lot of education that we do in the community about how those are all myths and that no one can deport you if you're a victim of violence. And just getting more people to understand those nuances and the services that we do provide here. South Dakota Voices for Peace is the only nonprofit organization providing free immigration legal services to these two groups of people. Lutheran Social Services, which is our ally and our partner, they really concentrate on providing legal services for their refugees that they're resettling, which makes sense. And they have some grants to do citizenship work. But there's only 7 immigration attorneys in the state of South Dakota. And like any other entrepreneur, when I started my law practice, we need to make money, so we have to charge for that service. And it becomes really heart-wrenching when these humanitarian issues come through your door. That's why I was not very successful in building a business, because I couldn't charge these people money, and I'm just so grateful that we have such an amazing community where we were able to launch these free legal services. So with that, I will hand it back over, and I look forward to staying and discussing some more. Thank you.